In the last part of this series, we went deep into history. You may be wondering where I'm going with all of this because this is a lot of history. You see, this world is built off lies and falsehoods. Being that we are now in the 21st century, and being that we are classified as probably the most educated society that ever lived, the majority of us can sometimes feel proudly like we understand this world that we live in. But the truth is that we are not the most educated, we are the most indoctrinated. We know nothing about the world that we live in. History has been told to us from a tainted perspective, and we have only been given small bits and pieces that keep us with a level of arrogant ignorance that is extremely dangerous. All of this would not matter if religion and our souls wasn't baked up into it all. For most believers, our level of understanding starts from the Bible, which the majority of us don't read in full. Then some of us know what happened in Rome with Constantine and the creation of the Roman Church. And then history gets a little fuzzy for over 12 centuries after Constantine until we get to the Protestant Reformation, which we also know little about, except that it happened, and it's why we're not Catholics anymore. Until we've got into our modern times of slavery, the American Revolution, the Civil War, World Wars I and II, leading us into our present day. The truth of the matter is that we really don't know anything, and we are just an ignorant, uneducated society of people that think we know something that we do not know. And throughout all of this, our souls are tied to some of this history that we accept, though we know little about. I'm speaking of the Protestant and English Reformation when I say that, to be specific. In this ministry, I do make a lot of claims, and there are many people that disagree with many of the conclusions I have made. I don't think it's right or fair for me to speak from my perspective and ask people to understand without at least teaching what it is that I have learned and studied. From this information, it can help give you more knowledge and wisdom when dealing with this world, and you can begin to be confident when speaking against certain movements and institutions and societies. The time period in the Renaissance is one of those periods in our history that needs to be dealt with. I think it was just last year when Beyonce comes out with a Renaissance album and tour. I remember during those times, my social media was flooded with people wearing silver and going to her occult concert celebrating the Renaissance, not knowing anything about this time period. Those in power use our ignorance against us, and they have us celebrate our own enslavement, celebrating things that have brought us deeper into deception. The period of the Renaissance was a horrible period in time, especially for those who are descendants of slaves from the transatlantic slave trade. Imagine celebrating a period of time where the power of this world plotted against you to put you in bondage and strip you from your identity. Imagine celebrating a time where they changed your calendar and time. They changed religion and adapted it to their own image. Imagine celebrating a period when magic and occult became prevalent in our world and society. It sounds crazy, but this is exactly what happened just last year as an example with Beyonce's Renaissance tour. And this is because people live in idolatry and ignorance. It's because we don't know anything about history, but a few words and titles, and we want to believe that our leaders and entertainers are genuinely good people. The period of the Renaissance is a period that truth became edited. And if you want to understand our enemy, I'm going to show you how deep this all is. The world we are in today is not one that was created by accident. In the last part of this series, I dealt with a lot of history of Rome and Europe, leading us into the Medici family, the richest family in European history that most of us never even heard of. Hopefully that history started opening your eyes to history and a world you were never introduced to. We've heard a lot about the Renaissance period, but we have yet to discuss what was actually changed. I want to take you through some of the major changes that took place in the Renaissance period so that you can better understand how we got to the Protestant Reformations, and then after the Reformation, how we got to the point in the world we are at today. The period of the Renaissance affects us all because those who held power in this world used this time period to begin a transformation that the whole world will be affected from. So we will begin to discuss what changed during the Renaissance period. Let's begin. Okay, so the first part of change we need to deal with is the doctrine of self that was brought to life in the Renaissance. This doctrine of self that is labeled as humanism, I mentioned it a few times in the last video. This movement is probably the biggest factor from the Renaissance that sparks the most change, and most people don't have a clue about it. We are all affected by it today. The humanist movement started during the period of the Renaissance, and without this movement, the Protestant Reformation would not have been possible. But to be clear, this humanist movement was not a good thing. The popular belief that surrounds this period of time was that the humanists of the Renaissance era had rediscovered the classical Latin and Greek texts, and this is where the concept of rebirth or renaissance of the classic world comes from. It is said that humanists created the European Renaissance and paved the way for a modern secular world. And this is why I spent so much time with the Medici family in the last part, because of how deceptive history is told. It is told from this general point of view that does not provide enough details so that one can truly understand what really happened. It's just basically like, yeah, some people rediscovered Greek and Latin and then brought it back into the limelight. But the truth is that the Medici family, whose wealth was created after the dissolution of the Knights Templar, used Templar wealth to push ideas that were about subtly introducing the doctrines of the esoteric order of the Templars. The Medici family used their wealth to accumulate vast Greek and Latin texts from the ancient world and brought it to Italy, which spurred the rebirth of pagan Roman society. So, what is humanism? Let's deal with that first. This is what you get if you search it. Humanism is a rationalist outlook attaching prime importance to humans rather than divine or supernatural matters. It is the belief that humans are rational beings. It is a devotion to humanity, a devotion to human welfare, a doctrine, attitude, or way of life centered on human interest or values. You see, these are the definitions that you get if you're to look this stuff up. Does any of these definitions help you really understand what humanism is? Well, it didn't for me. And for me personally, it makes sense for me. In college, the first class I ever failed and had to retake was humanities. I never understood what it was that they were trying to teach me. I never latched onto it. I never understood humanity. So when I'm hearing all this, it makes no sense. So let's try to break it down a little more simpler to understand. In the period of the Renaissance, humanism stood for a view of life that while they devoutly accepted the existence of God, they shared many of the intellectual attitudes of the ancient pagan world that contradicted with what was previously taught. Basically, they used the 12th centuries of the building of the Roman Church, with Rome making themselves as the authority and creating a foundation of the Christian religion without people actually reading the Bible. They just made this religion. Then in this new humanist movement, they begin to introduce more pagan, Gnostic, and esoteric ideas that began to reintroduce religion to them in a way more adaptable to their own lives. Through humanism, the people were interested in arts and beauty. It focused on oneself more than devoting themselves to God. It stressed earthly fulfillment rather than preparation for paradise. It had its spiritual side, yes, but it reflected a society that was more interested in worldly matters, a society that was self-conscious and ambitious. You know how 2 Timothy chapter 3 prophesies that in the last days, men will become lovers of themselves? Well, this new humanist movement in the Renaissance was the beginning of fulfilling this prophecy. It pretty much is summarized as being a doctrine of self. That's what humanism is. And from this, people began focusing more on themselves and then bringing God into their lives. It's important to note that the Renaissance thinkers that created this doctrine, they did not themselves use the term humanism, and they didn't agree on all subjects. This doctrine of self was not labeled humanism during the Renaissance, but later in the 19th century when historians went back to understand the change that occurred during this period. Humanism is how they classified the change. But let's understand it more. The main elements of Renaissance humanism include an interest in studying literature and art from antiquity, an interest in the eloquent use of Latin and philosophy, a belief in the importance and power of education to create useful citizens, the promotion of private and civic virtue, a rejection of scholasticism. This was the way of thought before humanism. The encouragement of non-religious studies, an emphasis on the individual and their moral autonomy, a belief in the importance of observation, critical analysis, and creativity, a belief that poets, writers, and artists can lead humanity to a better way of living, an interest in the question, what does it mean to be human? And all of those points are a good summary of what it was all about. And if you look at all this and then think about the world that we're currently in, you can begin to connect dots on how we got here at this present day. Understand that these thoughts and ideals were not the accepted norm in society before the times of the Renaissance. But after this period in history, the world was forever changed, and we are affected by it to this day. But this still doesn't really tell you the full story. So let's keep digging. So yeah, they began to study ancient literature and art and began to have an interest in studies that did not have to do with Christianity. They began focusing on the development of themselves, and this is the main area that you should focus on when understanding humanism. They started thinking about themselves more than they started thinking about God. There became a lot of philosophies of men that European Christians began to wrestle with, and the humanist movement was the first real clash with the religion of Christianity. New topics in education and going back to the pagan roots of Greece and Rome began to develop. Those who were being educated started questioning the church in their beliefs. Now, it should not be a surprise on how this began if you understand what I'm speaking of in reference to the Templars and then the Medici family. You must understand that this was a result of the Templars. After they went hidden, they came back in society with their occult knowledge and began to spread it through their rationalizations. For example, with Cosimo Medici, starting Europe's first public library, the Library of San Marco, and from this began to challenge the church's long monopoly of learning. His new education started challenging the church. This is exactly what happens today too. Imagine a family member brought up in the church, but then later as an adult, they are introduced to occult knowledge. They now want to convert their family, but don't want to run them away too quickly. What they do is slowly start introducing concepts that challenge their faith and make them start questioning why you believe what you do. The humanist movement in the Renaissance was the beginning of this. And this is how the Protestant Reformation happened, and then the creation of all these other different denominations. People started getting caught up into philosophies and ways of thought that started to challenge the status quo, and this led to many doctrines that we are dealing with today. This is why, in my own view, I do not engage in these ways of thoughts and all these philosophies, as we are called to beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Messiah. That's Colossians chapter 2, verse 8. If we would just take heed to this advice, this would keep us from many problems. But nonetheless, this way of thought of humanism was beginning to challenge the older way. You see, like I have repeatedly said, what the actual change that was beginning to sprout up due to humanism was a doctrine of self. There was a doctrine being taught amongst European Christians that even though they loved God, they were supposed to focus more on their own self more than focus on God. I use the title God here because they are not referring to the Most High, Yahuah. Anyways, people started focusing more on themselves than their focus on God. This was the main thought being spread at this time, and this thought became the leading philosophy as we go through the Renaissance. And we can see that doctrine of self never left us. And so through this, we see a revival of what they call classical literature. It's important to know that when they say classical Greek and Roman literature, this is always a nice way of saying ancient pagan texts and literature. There was also an emergence in going back to the pagan roots in education, philosophy, and science. And I will deal with that, but that is not the main thing I want to focus on when dealing with humanism. What I want to focus on is what was done through art. Because here's the deal. Even though much of these philosophies and different ways of thought are prevalent in our society today, it must be understood that back during this period of the Renaissance is when they were beginning to create the foundation for all these lies that we all have been believing in to this day. These lies start with art, and that includes history. Let me give you a quick example of how deep this all is. Let's say you wanted to start studying history, and you wanted to go to Rome and go back and understand the history of the church, because you know this is the center of where the religion of Christianity started in the world. We all know what many of the modern lies are today, yes. But for many of us in America and abroad, we know of the history of the Roman Catholic Church. So it would be assumed that if you wanted to start to get some knowledge of history of Christianity, you should go to Rome and investigate. Go to the first churches. Go to where Peter and Paul were said to be imprisoned. Go see what they call St. Peter's Church. where they say Peter was buried. This is where they say all the ancient history is, right? So yeah, you go to Rome looking for answers in history. Do you know what you find there? Cover-ups and lies. There's history, yes, but you find a continuing strange coincidence. Let me show you. Let's say we start here. You're in Rome, so you go to see the Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica. This is the site that Catholic tradition states is the burial site of the Apostle Peter, who they claim to be the first bishop of Rome, the first pope. St. Peter's is the largest church in the world by interior measure. But as you ask your tour guide questions and you want to see some history from the 4th and 5th century, they say, oh, that would be in the old St. Peter's Basilica. You see, old St. Peter's Basilica was a building that stood from the 4th to the 16th centuries. But that's not here anymore. The aging old St. Peter's Basilica, which was built in the 4th century by Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, it was old. It was torn down and reconstructed during the Renaissance. The Medici family financed the reconstruction of this holy site. Construction of the present basilica, it began on April 18, 1506. It was completed on November 18, 1626. That's what she tells you. You see, St. Peter's Church at the Vatican is one of the most renowned works of Italian Renaissance architecture. But if you went there to see history, this history is only 400 plus years old. So yeah, you say to her, as she explains this, okay, I guess that makes sense. Church was old. Wait, so does that mean this is new too? And you look at the Sistine Chapel, and your tour guide tells you, yeah, I mean, this is new too, if you want to say new. The Sistine Chapel, it's a chapel in the Apostolic Palace, the Pope's official residence in Vatican City. The chapel takes its name from Pope Sixtus IV, who had it built between 1473 and 1481. This was the 15th century during the Renaissance. Today, it's the site of the papal conclave, the process by which a new pope is elected. But yeah, I guess you could say that. It's not that old in comparison to the history of Christianity. But okay, as you're thinking, that makes sense since the Vatican was rebuilt because it was old. All right. Well, you tell your tour guide, well, I want to see some history. You ask your tour guide to take you somewhere else. How about this church? It's called Santa Prisca, a church of Rome. It's devoted to Saint Prisca, a 1st century martyr whose relics are contained in the altar in the crypt. They say it was built in the 4th or 5th century over a temple of Mithras. It is a church built over a pagan temple to Mithras. I mean, first off, that's deep. There's got to be some history there. Now, as you see this church, you say to yourself, how crazy can these people be to make what they call a Christian church over a site that was once a pagan temple to Mithras, a pagan god? These people are crazy delusional, but you've been known that. This fact of it being built over a pagan temple just confirms it. But you're looking for history. You get to the site and it looks like the new churches. Your tour guide tells you that this current site is due to the 1660 restoration during the Renaissance, which included a new facade by Carlo Lombardi. Okay, so that's new too. Maybe you're not understanding. I want to see history. Can we go to see the Pantheon? I know there's some history there. And she says yes, this is actually quite old. And for the first time, you get to see some older history. You see, the Pantheon was a former Roman temple. They used to worship pagan gods there, and then they later converted it to a Christian church. Pantheon, meaning of relating to or common to all the gods. The name Pantheon is from the ancient Greeks, and since AD 609, it's now a Catholic church. But when you get there, the smell coming out of there doesn't seem right, and the way they're worshiping says, don't go in there. But yeah, this is another church with pagan roots. But even worse than Santa Prisca, which was built on a pagan temple site, this Pantheon temple itself was dedicated to all the gods, the temple itself. But then they later on decided just to make it Christian. Ridiculous. But now, as you're thinking about it, that makes sense why this building is still standing and is one of the oldest buildings not reconstructed. They weren't touching the building that was always dedicated to their pagan gods. But what about those paintings and drawings inside? How old are they, you ask your tour guide. Oh, in the 15th century during the Renaissance, the Pantheon was adored with paintings, The best known is the Annunciation by Meloso de Forlì. Oh, so the building stands and doesn't get reconstructed, but in the Renaissance, they repainted it with Christian art. Gotcha. So you tell your tour guide, listen, where is the oldest Christian church? Please take me there. I want to see the oldest Christian church. Okay, let's go. You get to St. John Lateran, a church dedicated to Christ in honor of John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. The place named Laterano, Lateran, comes from an ancient Roman family whose palace grounds occupied the site. The church is the oldest and highest ranking of the 4 major papal basilicas, as well as one of the 7 pilgrim churches of Rome. It was founded in 324. It is the oldest public church in the city of Rome and the oldest basilica of the Western world. You say, thank you, finally some real history. So you get out and start looking for some history and tell your guide, wow, it looks like all the other reconstructed churches. Were they all following this style when they rebuilt the others? Oh, well, there were 2 fires, one in 1307 and the other in 1361, and they ravaged the church. During the Renaissance, Pope Sixtus V, from 1585 to 1590, in one of his urban renewal projects, tore down St. John Lateran's original buildings, replacing them with late Renaissance structures by his favorite architect, Domenico Fontana. Oh my goodness. And listen, I could keep going on and on. You see, during the Renaissance period, there was a complete recreation of history. In the year 1420, Pope Martin V moved the papal seat back to Rome after the papal schism. He at once set to work establishing order and restoring the dilapidated churches, palaces, bridges, and other public structures. You must understand that in order to take on a task like this, it comes with a great deal of investment. Himself, as well as the other popes, were only able to do this reconstruction through the financing of the Medici Bank. The Medicis financed this whole Renaissance movement. But here's the deal. It's not just the architecture that changed. It's all their history. And they began a replacement and transition into lies using their doctrine of humanism. So let me bring it back to humanism. We know they began to study ancient pagan literature and look back at pagan art and began to have an interest in ancient pagan studies that did not have anything to do with Christianity. We know they began focusing on the development of themselves. We know that a lot of philosophies of men that European Christians began to wrestle with were started at this time. But the main difference is the subtle untruth that was created during the Renaissance that feeds into the current lie of today. A part of the humanist movement was creating and feeding their lie that they're still feeding us with today. The humanist movement started with the movement of these people creating the doctrine of making God in their image. They started making their religious art adaptable to themselves. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In 1442, Pope Martin V, I mentioned him earlier, he gave the Medicis permission to build a private chapel with a portable family altar. The chapel was on the first floor of the Medicis' private residence, and it was dedicated to the Holy Trinity. More on that later. Cosimo chose Benozzo Gozzoli, an Italian Renaissance painter from Florence, of course, to decorate the chapel. He painted the Procession of the Magi. This painting is said to recall the journey made by the Magi to pay homage to the infant Jesus. It extends across the east, south, and west walls of the main room above the encircling benches. Each wall represents one of the 3 Magi, or wise men, or kings. The east wall leads off with the youngest king. The story continues on the south wall with the middle king and ends on the west wall with the oldest king. Okay, so we know about the painting now. But where am I going with this? What does humanism have to do with this? You see, humanism is introduced when we start looking at the people being depicted. So we go to the east wall with the youngest king. And who is depicted here? This is Lorenzo the Magnificent, Lorenzo Medici. He leads the procession on a white horse, and he is said to represent the youngest wise man. And mounted behind him were Piero, father of Lorenzo, son of Cosimo, as well as Cosimo Medici himself, riding on a donkey in imitation to Christ. So where does humanism enter in? Right here. This is what you're looking at. This is humanism. The Medici family included themselves in this important religious event. They depicted themselves into history. They retold this story in their image. They began to tell the stories of the Bible in their own image. And that is what humanism is. Anytime you research the Renaissance and you see that word humanism, this is what it means. They were telling the stories of the Bible in their own image, as long as with the other pagan stories as well. They started making their religious art adaptable to themselves. It had nothing to do with history. They knew the truth. The Yahudim were in their countries. They were being persecuted already through the Crusades. They knew who they were. It was during the Renaissance when the Spanish Inquisition was happening, when Portugal sent the Yahudim to Africa, and when this transatlantic slave trade started. This was all during the Renaissance. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. What I'm saying is that they knew the truth. You should understand that they were not about the truth. They were about making God adaptable to themselves. So just like they can make a pagan temple into a Christian church, they had no problem with making the people of the Bible into figures that were more relatable to them. And this was a major part of the humanist movement. They began to recreate visual truths of the Bible, and this was not by accident either. This was very much a conspiracy, but I do not want to go too fast through this. We will just start with changing history through their paintbrush. This is important to understand. When I speak about the truth about the identity of the true Yahudim, and I try to explain who it was that was taken in the transatlantic slave trade, I am often met with hostility because of feelings about race. This is a hard subject for many people to get over. What many do not understand is that they have been conditioned and indoctrinated to identify biblical figures in a certain skin tone, and because of the overwhelming barrage of depictions, we have been conditioned to accept something and a group of people without actually knowing we were doing so. This is not something that has always been. We don't have imagery of Israel because that's not their culture. It's according to the commandments. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, Yahuah, your Elohim, am a jealous El, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 through 5. You see, this was the way of Yasharel, and this is the reason why we don't have visual depictions of Yasharel. But what happened in Rome is just more evidence of their falsehoods and lies, because while they claim to be the true church, they make all these depictions that are completely in rejection to Yahuah's commands. People bow to them, pray to them, and put these images in their homes. And being that now we are 4 to 5 centuries deep into this indoctrination, this is how we're so caught up into race. The doctrine of race was not even invented yet at this time. People accuse me of speaking about race, but they don't recognize I'm just trying to clear up falsehoods that have been indoctrinated into us over centuries. It all started during the Renaissance. Now, if we go back in history, the conventional image of a fully bearded Jesus with long hair emerged around 300 AD, but it did not become established until the 6th century in Eastern Christianity. There are many depictions of Yahusha and Israel with brown skin, like we see in Egypt. But in Europe, the first portraits of Messiah, in the sense of an authoritative likeness, goes back to the 6th century in the Byzantine Empire with Ahirapita. It's also called the icon of the Savior, image not made by hands. This belief on the image originated in the 7th century AD, based on a legend that Christ healed King Abgar of Edessa in modern-day Urfa, Turkey, through a miraculous image of his face, now known as the Mandalion. A similar legend adopted by Western Christianity between the 11th and 14th centuries recounts how, before his death by crucifixion, Christ left an impression of his face on the veil of Saint Veronica, an image known as the Volto Santo, or Holy Face. These two images, along with other similar relics like the Shroud of Turin, which is a Templar relic, they have formed the basis of iconic traditions about the true image of Messiah. What I'm saying is that the depictions of Messiah were not a common thing before the Renaissance, but during the Renaissance, art began to change. Renaissance art, painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and literature produced during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries in Europe were under combined influences from an increased awareness of nature, a revival of classical learning, meaning Greek and Roman paganism, and due to humanism, there was a more individualistic view of man. And that simply means that they started being more defined in their details of who they were depicting. They started making their art more aligned with their image. It's also why we have Latin and Greek names of Hebrew men. The humanist movement in art during the Renaissance, of course, started in Florence, Italy, under the leadership and funding of the Medici family. We'll start with him. Giotto was one of the most important Italian painters of the 14th century. His paintings ushered in a new era in painting that brought together religious antiquity and the developing idea of Renaissance humanism. He is best known for the way he explored the possibilities of perspective and pictorial space, and in doing so, he brought a new sense of realism to his religious parables. His new realism emphasized its humanity through his attention to fine detail. His figures were rendered in three-dimensional space through motions and gestures and on fine costume and furnishing details. Though they were devoted to Christ, his human figures formed the center of his narratives. Word of his accomplishments reached the Pope in Rome, who was looking for an artist to execute several paintings at the Cathedral of St. Peter. The Pope invited Giotto to Rome, and he executed a number of frescoes. You'll hear me use this word often, frescoes. Frescoes are a painting done rapidly in watercolor on wet plaster on a wall or ceiling, so that the colors penetrate the plaster and become fixed as it dries. This is what you'll see a great deal of in this Renaissance art. So yeah, the Pope invited Giotto to Rome, and he executed a number of frescoes and paintings in St. Peter's Basilica and for the Pope's residence, but few have survived. He died mid-14th century. Over 100 years after his death, the Medici family commissioned a marble bust of Giotto and had it installed in the Church of Santa Maria del Fiore with the following inscription: "I am that man by whose deeds painting was raised from the dead. My hand as ready as it was sure. My art lacked nothing that nature herself did not also lack. No one painted anything better or more completely than I did." And from him, the beginning of Renaissance art was inspired. The spirit of the Renaissance did not surface again until the beginning of the 15th century, when Cosimo Medici took over leadership of the Medici family in 1434. During their rise of influence, the Medici financed virtually the entire range of humanistic and artistic activities associated with the Renaissance. One of Cosimo's first endeavors was rebuilding the Dominican monastery of San Marco. Cosimo paid for the monastery to be almost completely rebuilt. In addition to the money that Cosimo spent on rebuilding the monastery, he also commissioned a wonderful series of frescoes to adorn the walls of each monk's cell, as well as the halls and meeting rooms of the monastery. He created a whole economy out of putting all these people to work through all this construction. The frescoes were painted by a monk, Fra Angelico, Brother Angel. Cosimo encouraged him to use his skill in painting to depict scenes from the life of Christ. He talked with Fra Angelico about the details of each fresco. For the chapter house, where all the monks assembled for worship and for official meetings, Cosimo and Fra Angelico decided that the walls should be decorated with a fresco depicting the crucifixion. Sandro Botticelli, who lived during the second half of the 15th century, was an apprentice of another artist sponsored by Cosimo, Fra Filippo. But the apprenticeship was a short 4 years because Filippo died. Sandro then established his own workshop and began accepting commissions. When I say commissions, that's an order for or an authorized production of some kind of work. Sandro began accepting commissions from Florence's churches. Botticelli got the attention of the Medici family, and they began to regularly commission paintings from him and to recommend him to their friends. As a part of the general fascination and revival of the ancient pagan world, the Medici family sponsored Botticelli to paint several large canvases depicting scenes from Greek mythology. In 1477 to 1478, he painted his two most recognized works, La Primavera and The Birth of Venus. In 1480 to 1482, he worked in Rome, on loan from the Medici family, on the frescoes which were on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. There are still 3 frescoes by Botticelli on the walls of the Sistine Chapel: scenes from the life of Moses, the temptation of Christ, and destruction of Korah. It is said that Botticelli was a homosexual, and I bring this up because this is also something that became a part of the culture during this European Renaissance. Many of these artists were, and you will find that this is also spread because the Templars themselves were accused of being homosexuals and doing homosexual acts. Now, if you're not noticing what was going on here, let me break it down real quick. Florence and Rome were a blank canvas. The Medici family funded art to be produced in grand scale, and they created a whole economy from it. Because of the new movement of humanism, these artists depicted Christian art from the humanist point of view. It had nothing, and I repeat, nothing to do with the accuracy of history, but only to do with art. And the 15th century was the great start of the art in the Renaissance. If you know of these times, you might have noticed that I did not mention Donatello earlier. Please note I did not leave him out. I'm just trying to give a timeline of progression, and for time's sake, I just didn't get to him. Now let's deal with probably one of the most well-known artists of the Renaissance. That's Leonardo da Vinci, another artist who lived during the second half of the 15th century and a quarter of the 16th. Da Vinci was an Italian painter, draftsman, sculptor, architect, and engineer whose skill and intelligence, perhaps more than any other figure, epitomized the Renaissance humanist ideal. The early years of Da Vinci's life, he worked in Florence in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, another leading painter during that time. Leonardo and Botticelli both were apprentices for Verrocchio. By 1476, he began working by himself until in 1482, when the Medici family sent him to Milan to paint for Milan's new ruler, Ludovico Sforza, a close friend of the Medici family. Leonardo entered the Duke's service, which is more likely where he was initiated into the occult as a Rosicrucian, but this is not clear. Leonardo spent 17 years in Milan until Ludovico's fall from power in 1499. While in Milan, Leonardo completed several works of art, one of the most famous being The Last Supper. The Duke of Milan commissioned Leonardo to paint Jesus and his 12 disciples at the Last Supper. The painting was to be done in the dining hall of the Dominican monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. Leonardo chose to portray the moment at which Jesus announces that one of the disciples will betray him. This is one of the most well-known religious pieces of art ever created, and it was done by an occultist. It is used in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code as a painting that told a hidden story about the Holy Grail and Mary Magdalene, all the story that leads to the Antichrist. This is a quote from the book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which Dan Brown's book Da Vinci Code is based from. Leonardo's esoteric interest and orientation, like Botticelli's, this has mentioned him being homosexual, have now been well established. Francis Yates, in conversation with one of our researchers, described him as an early Rosicrucian. But in Leonardo's case, esoterica would appear to extend even further than in Botticelli's. Even Vasari, his biographer and contemporary, describes him as being of a heretical cast of mind. What precisely might have constituted his heresy remains unclear. During the last few years, however, certain authorities have ascribed to him an ancient heretical belief that Jesus had a twin. Certainly, there is evidence for this contention in a cartoon sketch called The Virgin with St. John the Baptist and St. Anne, and in the famous Last Supper, where there are, in fact, 2 virtually identical Christ. But there is no indication of whether the doctrine of Jesus' twin is to be taken literally or symbolically. You see, this man, Da Vinci, was a heretic and occultist, and Holy Blood, Holy Grail lists him as a Grand Master of the Priory of Sion from 1510 to 1519 when he died. I will not get into this here, but the Priory of Sion are said to be guardians of the Holy Grail from which the Templars were protectors of. This is the occult and a part of the plan and agenda for the Antichrist from which Leonardo da Vinci is very well known to be a part of. But yet, in the Christian world, this man's work is revered through Christianity. Let's keep talking about him. After French troops overthrew Ludovico in Milan, da Vinci returned home to Florence. In 1502, he worked as a military engineer for legendary Prince Caesar Borgia. Borgia, the notorious gangster son of Pope Alexander VI, was commander-in-chief of the papal army, and he sought with ruthlessness to gain control of the papal states of Romagna and the Marches. When he enlisted the services of Leonardo, he was at the peak of his power. At age 27, Caesar Borgia was undoubtedly the most compelling and most feared person of his time. At the court of Caesar Borgia, Leonardo also met Niccolò Machiavelli, who was temporarily stationed there as a political observer for the city of Florence. Sometime after his return to Florence, Leonardo was commissioned to paint the Mona Lisa, a work universally acknowledged to be a work of artistic perfection. Another occult piece of work depicting Mary Magdalene as a sacred feminine. Also, in 1503, Leonardo received a prize commission to paint a mural for the council hall in Florence's Palazzo Vecchio. Both him and his rival Michelangelo each were to compete a scene depicting an important battle in the history of the Florentine Republic. For 3 years, he worked on this battle of Anghiari. Like Michelangelo's battle of Cassina, it remained unfinished. The last 10 years of his life, Leonardo spent in Milan, Rome, then France, where he was offered several important commissions by Pope Leo X, who was Giovanni de' Medici of the Medici family. Yes, eventually 4 of the Medici family members became popes. King Francis I of France invited Leonardo to move to France, where the king would provide him with a house, servants, and a stipend. Francis bestowed upon Leonardo the title of first painter, architect, and mechanic of the king. This man's life is an example of an important person in the world that is a guardian of a secret. His life is an example of the secret society's influence, and this was the world of the Renaissance that was being built. But his work has greatly influenced the religious world, and this man was not a true believer in the faith and actually guarded occult secrets and agendas. Leonardo, along with many other artists of his time, reinterpreted traditional iconography. Iconography is the visual images and symbols used in a work of art or the study or interpretation of these. They began depicting imagery of the Bible in their own image and by their own ideals, and us today in our modern society, we are completely indoctrinated by it. Let me keep going on to the last important figure in regards to art, and by this last example, I think my point should be made clear. Michelangelo, born in the late 15th century, 1475 in Florence, was said to be drawing since he was a young child. At age 14, he was an apprentice to Domenico Ghirlandaio in Florence. Yes, all these main people were in Florence. At this time, the leader of the Medici family, Lorenzo de' Medici, also known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, he had a desire for sculptors because there was already a great many painters, but still no sculptors whose work could compare with the works of the Greeks and the Romans. Lorenzo began a school in the garden of the Medici Palace. Lorenzo asked Ghirlandaio to send him 2 of his best students, and one of them he sent was 15-year-old Michelangelo, who quickly became a favorite of Lorenzo Medici. Lorenzo invited Michelangelo to live in the Medici Palace and treated him like a son. Michelangelo received many commissions for works of art from the Medicis and other wealthy Florentine families, as well as from the area's many churches and monasteries. In 1495, he finished a sculpture of a sleeping Cupid that was sent to Rome, and from this, Michelangelo was sent for to come to Rome and take up residence at the Cardinal's palace. While in Rome, Michelangelo received commissions from many princes of the church and wealthy Roman families. One of his most famous pieces of sculpture, the Pieta, was done during this period. Then in 1501, he went back to Florence and was given a large block of marble over 16 feet high. For 2 years, he worked on his carving of David. Michelangelo depicted him at the moment just before he launches his attack on Goliath. This is supposed to be a biblical image. It was recognized as a masterpiece. Now, I must say that seeing this statue, it is an awesome piece of work, yes. And in that museum, there are a bunch of other sculptures made from many others during this Renaissance period. It was very well created. But the thing is that none of this had anything to do with history, but it was all a part of the humanist movement. They adapted these biblical figures in their own image. David didn't look like a Roman. The sculpture David was never made to be historically accurate, but just a great work by a talented artist. But over centuries, this influence has been what we know and what has been depicted as truth. The statue David's nudity had been a subject of debate and censorship since it appeared in Florence Piazza del Signoria in 1504. I don't really like showing it on this video because it's really ridiculous. It's nudity, it's completely ridiculous. He was bringing forth a nude, grotesque image that was obscene, and he made it acceptable as simple art. This was a change in morality and culture. But it works the same today. The more obscene and vulgar you get, unless there's a complete revolution against it, people begin to conform to it and they just deal with it. And that was the start of it. That was the start of seeing nudity in art and it just being a common thing. Okay, so let's keep going. Michelangelo returned to Rome later and was asked by Pope Julius to design and execute a series of frescoes to decorate the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, almost 6,000 square feet. Michelangelo divided the ceiling into 9 panels. 6 tell the story of creation and the fall. 3 are scenes from the story of Noah and the flood. The most famous portion is the 4th panel, which shows the creation of Adam, all in their image. Pope Julius died in 1513 and was succeeded by Giovanni de' Medici, who took the name Leo X. Michelangelo was no stranger to the new pope, being that Michelangelo was growing up in the Medici Palace in Florence. Pope Leo commissioned additional works of art from his old friend Michelangelo. After Leo's death in 1534, the newly elected Pope Paul III asked Michelangelo to paint the Last Judgment on the front wall of the Sistine Chapel. It was immense, and it took 7 years. In 1545, the same Pope Paul III appointed Michelangelo chief architect of the Vatican. His duties included supervising the completion of the Church of St. Peter in Rome. And this was how Rome and Florence became inundated with religious art. These painters, along with many more during this Renaissance period, were hired to decorate Rome with religious art, and they did this on overload. They created a religious doctrine that spoke volumes without ever saying a word. It was a carefully carried out conspiracy that also went along with other agendas against the true Yahudim in Europe. These agendas carried out against them by the Medicis and the Borgias. Understand the conspiracy. In order to tell a grand lie, they tore down any resemblance to history, reimagined it, and revisualized it in one way only, and then they removed the people that the Bible that they promoted was about. The events in Europe, like the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades, are all well documented. This is the Renaissance period, a time where the foundation of the lies we are controlled by today began to be told. This was just the beginning of the story, because I haven't even got to the Borgias and the other changes during the Renaissance. It's important that you understand the humanist movement and how they reconstructed history and put a new visual identity to it. This is all historic fact, and if you believe that when I speak of the true Yahudim, I am being racial, it's only because of this indoctrination that you yourself are influenced by. The secret societies work together to push an agenda to fulfill their own prophecy using their own bloodline that they were guarding and protecting. The lies run deep, and the majority of these lies start at the period of the Renaissance. This culture that's found from the Renaissance is based upon a culture and influence from their father, the devil. As Yahusha said, "You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do." He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. That's John chapter 8, verse 44. The Apostle Paul sums this Renaissance movement up very clearly in the first chapter of Romans when he writes, "For the wrath of Elohim is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of Elohim is manifest in them, for Elohim has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, because although they knew Elohim, they did not glorify him as Elohim, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible Elohim into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore Elohim also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of Elohim for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, Elohim gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain Elohim in their knowledge, Elohim gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of Elohim, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of Elohim, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. That's Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, and that is a great summary of the Renaissance period. It is highly important that you review your thoughts and your influences and make sure that you yourself are not guided or influenced by this wicked moment in history. So much more happens during this period, but now that you understand how this movement was financed and by who, while you also know exactly what some of the changes were, it should help you better understand what truly happened in this world and how we got to the point in time that we're at right now. In the next part, we need to go deeper into some of the other agendas and events that happened during the period of the Renaissance. You know that the letter J was created during this period, right? Where Caesar Borgia became the image of Messiah by his father. And this is when the true Yahudim were taken captive as slaves. There's a lot more history that we must go through so that we can clearly wake up to the lies and the schemes. Now that these things are being revealed, it is imperative that you make the decision to live in the truth and serve our Father the way He has declared in His Word, and make sure you are setting yourself apart from the wickedness of these time periods and these movements. You are being set free. Please continue to walk in knowledge and grow in wisdom while we all prepare ourselves for Yahuah. For believe, His kingdom is truly at hand. Be blessed. Hallelujah. Praise Yah. Okay, thanks again for watching. If this has blessed you, please don't forget to like this and share this video with others. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to this channel. Yah willing, I upload every Friday. Also, please don't forget to follow this ministry on Facebook and Instagram, as well as on my website, truthunedited.com. To all of you, thank you for watching. I'm thankful for all of you. Thank you especially to those Yah has placed it on your hearts to give, and you have done so. I thank you for your assistance in carrying out this ministry every week. Thank you for your blessings and your prayers. Your prayers and support truly hold up this ministry. Thank you for being a blessing. Okay, thanks again everyone for watching. I love you all.